Hello there, welcome to Planet America's Fireside Chat. I'm John Barron.
And I'm Licciardello.
This week, what was it like running one of America's top intelligence agencies under both Barack Obama and Donald Trump? Former NSA Chief Mike Rogers is our special guest.
We have the latest campaign news as well as a look at the latest incredibly close polls. And we'll also examine the issue of ghost guns in the briefing room with Melina Wicks. But first...
The former Chief of Staff to Donald Trump, General John Kelly, says that Trump fits the definition of a fascist and he prefers a dictator's approach to government and believes Hitler did some good things. The stunning comments came in a series of interviews with the New York Times reporter Michael Schmidt this week. Here's audio of the exchange where Kelly, who was Trump's Chief of Staff from 2017 to 2019, says that the former president essentially is a fascist.
But certainly the former president is in the far right area. He's certainly an authoritarian, admires people who are dictators. He has said that. So he certainly falls into the general definition of fascist, for sure.
Kelly was reportedly motivated to speak on the record after being appalled at Trump's suggestion that he would use the US National Guard or even the military to combat what he's been terming as the enemy from within. That report came the day after Jeffrey Goldberg of The Atlantic published a lengthy piece detailing several previously reported comments by Trump attacking members of the military, and also provided more examples of Trump's interest in and praise for Hitler and the Nazis, telling aides reportedly on one occasion that he wanted personal loyalty to him and needed the kind of generals Hitler had, ones that follow orders. Brian Kilmeade on Fox and Friends tried to defend Trump's reported comments, but not sure it came out quite as Brian hoped.
It would be great to have German generals that actually do what we asked them to do, knowing that's a third, maybe not fully being cognizant of the third rail of German generals who are Nazis and whatever.
Nazis or whatever? Okay, Brian. It was a free hit for Kamala Harris, who was then asked about Kelly's comment at a CNN town hall yesterday.
You yourself have not used that word to describe him. Let me ask you tonight, do you think Donald Trump is a fascist?
Yes, I do. Yes, I do. And I also believe that the people who know him best on this subject should be trusted. Again, look at their careers. These are not people, with the exception, I think, of only Mike Pence. These were not politicians. These are career people who have served in the highest roles in national security.
Okay, now there are two different stories here. So let's start with the Jeffrey Goldberg piece, which we actually talked about on Wednesday.
Yep.
It introduced the idea of Trump publicly offering to pay for the funeral of a murdered Latino soldier. But then when Trump supposedly found out that the funeral cost $60,000, he allegedly said, "It doesn't cost $60,000 to bury a fucking Mexican. Don't pay it." The family's lawyer, Natalie Kawan, then allegedly told Goldberg that she sent the bill to the White House, but no money was ever received by the family from Trump. Now, we did speak about that on Wednesday. The reason I went into it again in that detail is because since Wednesday, that lawyer, Natalie Kawan, has tweeted out, "After having dealt with hundreds of reporters in my legal career, this is unfortunately the first time I have to go on record and call out Jeffrey Goldberg. Not only did he misrepresent our conversation, but he outright lied." So that's a pretty strong denial from the person that Goldberg himself described as a key source for his story. On the other hand, though, she did at least describe his story as sensational. So there is that, John.
Maybe.
But more seriously, though, she did also note that the timing of this story is quite suspicious. She asked, "This conversation would have happened 4 years ago. Why the story about it now?" And that, I think, is a good question. Almost exactly 4 years ago, Jeffrey Goldberg published that piece about Trump referring to dead soldiers as suckers and losers. And look, he seems to have some form at trying to influence elections with his reporting. Doesn't mean that what he's saying isn't true, of course. The stories can be correct, but it's just worth bearing in mind when we're trying to assess who's credible and who we trust and who isn't. While we're at it, the sister of the dead soldier has reiterated that denial that Goldberg printed in his piece from her, saying, "I don't appreciate how you're exploiting my sister's death for politics. President Donald Trump did nothing but show respect to my family and Vanessa. In fact, I voted for President Trump today. Now, Jeffrey Goldberg in his piece very much implied that he thought the Trump campaign had paid the family off after they knew that this piece was coming. And so then the family and their lawyer have every incentive to issue those denials. That all checks out. But while we consider who we trust here, we should also note that Mark Meadows' spokesperson also tweeted something out. Bear in mind that in Goldberg's story, Trump said those statements directly to Mark Meadows. The spokesperson printed the text that he claims to have sent The Atlantic, and the text reads, President Donald Trump absolutely did not say that. But in his piece, Jeffrey Goldberg wrote that Meadows denied having heard the statement. That's the quote. That's a much softer way of putting his denial. It's not saying he heard everything and he said, no, Trump did not say that. It's saying, oh, he might have said it, he might not have said it. I didn't hear it. So that's much softer. If indeed that is the text that Jeffrey Goldberg received, and that's an if, it does suggest that Goldberg was putting his thumb on the scale of his story. So, John, does any of what I just said change your view about the credibility of Goldberg's story?
I have no doubts about the credibility of Jeffrey Goldberg. Jeffrey Goldberg is the editor of The Atlantic. He hosts PBS's Washington Week program, a weekly roundtable program. He's a highly esteemed journalist with very, very highly placed sources. We've met him. He's been on this show. Jeffrey Goldberg, I would be shocked if he is making up quotes. I would be shocked if he is lying in the way that the lawyer for somebody who has possibly now been reimbursed and wants the whole thing to go away and has possibly signed an agreement to no longer talk about it, etc. I mean, who's conflicted in all of this? Well, everybody. Jeffrey Goldberg clearly doesn't think very highly of Donald Trump. Jeffrey Goldberg also has very highly placed sources in the former Trump administration, highly placed sources in the military establishment who are outraged at Donald Trump. And they've informed a lot of reporting that Goldberg has done, not just in that piece 4 years ago, but a number of times. So Goldberg revisiting that now, I don't see that as election interference. I see that as his sources are again saying, OK, I'm prepared to go a little bit further, including John Kelly, by the way, appears to be a source of his. So I have no doubts about that. As for the complete denials, well, people can remember different things. And when notes are not being taken in the room at the time, one aide can hear a conversation and remember it as Trump saying, I'm not going to pay those effing Mexicans or pay that money to bury an effing Mexican. Mark Meadows, is he credible in that situation, saying nothing of the sort was ever said? Look, I doubt that, personally.
For what's worth, I believe Goldberg. I just want to give people the facts and they can make up their own mind.
Sure.
On to the second story, the John Kelly one. That has a bit more opinion about it, but, well, John Kelly's opinion. And an interesting counterpoint has come from another of Trump's ex-nominees, who was John Bolton. And he had this to say about Kelly's claims that Trump is a fascist.
I think it's a mistake to get into a controversy over whether Trump meets the definition of fascist or not. I think his behavior alone is troubling enough. To be a fascist, you have to have a philosophy. Trump's not capable of that. You know, Adolf Hitler wrote a profoundly troubling book called Mein Kampf, My Struggle. Donald Trump couldn't even read his way all the way through that book, let alone write something like it. I'm not trying to understate the dangers of a Trump presidency. I think it's important to focus on the dangers themselves.
Bolton then went on to agree with Rex Tillerson that Trump was, quote, a fucking moron. I'm not sure that's the kind of defence that Trump would be enjoying receiving. Yeah. But look, personally, I think judging Trump more on his behaviour rather than trying to define it or label it is a sensible thing to do, though, what Bolton was saying. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, I mean, there's no problem with defining the behaviour. I think Bolton's right. Trump isn't setting out reading Mein Kampf and going, I think I'm going to become a fascist. That's a good worldview. I'm going to do that. I think, yeah, Trump can be an authoritarian by instinct, a dictator by desire, and a fascist by default. without knowing what any of these things are. He just doesn't understand the Constitution, he doesn't understand history, and he certainly doesn't respect the rule of law. He didn't as a businessman, he didn't as president, he doesn't as a presidential candidate. It's kind of funny that John Bolton says this guy's not ideological enough to be considered a fascist. Some people believe that John Bolton is ideological enough to be considered a fascist. I don't personally believe that. He's just a old school neocon who would happily do some of the more aggressive things that Trump might do as well. That's why he went to work for him, because John Bolton, like many people that have gone to work with Donald Trump, they say they're going there to work for Trump to try and curb his excesses. But a lot of them see him as an empty vessel that they can pour their own ideology or their own priorities or their own business interests or their own philosophies into. Donald Trump is completely inconsistent except for the one thing, that he's a populist and he does whatever he thinks is popular, be that with people in the Midwest or people in the Kremlin. And
the point you make about these people going to use Trump, that's something you have in common with Trump. He thinks that as well. Everyone's trying to use me.
He's absolutely right.
Yes. I just want to add two things to this. Firstly, there's a company called Blueprint that does qualitative polling for Democrats on what are the most effective attack lines they can use against Republicans. This is the line that they found out of all the lines most effective to attack Trump on. Nearly half of Donald Trump's cabinet have refused to endorse him. When Trump learned during the Capitol riot that his supporters were threatening to kill his own vice president, he said, "So what?" and refused to do anything to ensure the vice president was safe. Republican governors, senators and House members have all said the same thing. We can't give Trump another 4 years as president. Now, there's a certain amount of overlap there with that line and the stories this week. They do coincide as the ideal attack for Kamala Harris, which doesn't mean that those stories aren't based on reality, but it does explain why Kamala Harris is pushing these stories as hard as she possibly can. They're perfect for her. But I also wanted to back over this enemy within quote of Trump's, which is getting a real run at the moment, especially from Kamala Harris. I think the context of that grab is gradually mutating from the original. This is how Kamala Harris referred to that quote yesterday.
In just the past week, Donald Trump has repeatedly called his fellow Americans the enemy from within, and even said that he would use the United States military to go after American citizens. And let's be clear about who he considers to be the enemy from within. Anyone who refuses to bend a knee or dares to criticize him would qualify in his mind as the enemy within.
Okay, so that's what Kamala Harris is saying. But I think that's very different to what Trump actually originally said. I'm now going to play you the actual quote in its full context, which you probably haven't seen before.
There was an Afghan refugee charged with plotting U.S. Election Day massacre.
Nothing surprises me.
What about that, though? Are you expecting chaos on Election Day?
No, I don't think so. Not from the side that votes for Trump.
But I'm just wondering if these outside agitators will start up on Election Day. Let's say you win. I mean, let's remember, you've got 50,000 Chinese nationals in this country in the last couple of years. You've got people on the terrorist watch list, 350 in the last couple of years. You've got, like you said, 13,000 murderers and 15,000 rapists.
Right.
What are you expecting? Joe Biden said he doesn't think it's going to be a peaceful Election Day.
Well, he doesn't have any idea what's happening in all fairness. He spends most of his day sleeping. I think the bigger problem is the enemy from within, not even the people that have come in and destroying our country. By the way, totally destroying our country. The towns, the villages, they're being inundated. But I don't think they're the problem in terms of Election Day. I think the bigger problem are the people from within. We have some very bad people. We have some sick people, radical left lunatics. And I think they're and it should be very easily handled by, if necessary, by National Guard, or if really necessary, by the military.
So, John, to me, that is clearly only about Election Day unrest he was talking about there. Protests that may or may not be violent. Now, that to me is bad enough. You do not set the military on any protesters ever. That's dictator stuff. Apparently, that was bad enough for John Kelly as well, because that prompted him to come out. Trump has since then, that quote, referred to Adam Schiff as the enemy within, Nancy Pelosi as the enemy within, many others as the enemy within. But he's never tied it to the threat of military intervention like he did in that grab right there. So what do you think? Am I splitting hairs here and trying to distinguish between those two usages of the term, or is the enemy within now being taken out of context?
Well, I think to an extent you are splitting hairs, because if you identify using the military against the enemy within and then either later in a rambling weave or in another interview at another place or another rally, you refer to Adam Schiff and Nancy Pelosi's as the enemy from within, all radical leftists, not just possible foreign terrorists or possible domestic troublemakers. He was clearly thinking in that moment about the Black Lives Matter protests that he turned the tear gas on and wanted to get Mark Milley to shoot at back in 2020 when he walked across Washington Square with an upside-down Bible. So look, Trump is mushing all these things together. So if you want to kind of literally pass them out and say, what did he exactly say? I think that's doing him a big favour. He's clearly learnt that some of the language he has used has been even too hot to handle for his supporters. At a rally in Arizona earlier today, he was referring instead, rather than the enemy from within, to the enemy of the people again, which is, just as fascistic as anything else.
Sure is.
But he's using that, and he acknowledged in his comments that they don't like me using this language kind of thing. So he's clearly got people saying, just cool it, and don't talk about using the military, because Trump would not know that that's crossing a red line. That's something that Kelly has said and Amelia has said. He didn't even understand the notion of the constitutional protections of American citizens and that you don't deploy the American military against the American people. It's a pretty fundamental rule, and Trump is oblivious to it. So again, you could say he's not being a fascist, he's just being an ignoramus.
Fair enough. Once again, you guys make up your own mind.
Indeed. Now, some absolutely fake news, which experts believe was generated by Russia, spread by supporters of Donald Trump, aided and abetted by Elon Musk's social media platform X, all aimed at damaging the Democratic vice presidential nominee Tim Walz. This is a computer-generated video image claiming to be a former student of Walz, and even though it looks pretty dodgy and nothing like the person whose identity it steals, it has been shared millions of times by pro-Trump accounts on X Twitter, with comments along with the clip such as this.
Breaking: Tim Walz's former student Matthew Metro posted a video online claiming he was sexually assaulted by Walz back in 1997. If this is true, she's done. The Kamala Harris-Tim Walz combo is done. America doesn't need a pedophile as vice president.
This is a 4-minute video clip allegation of something that was alleged to have happened in the 1990s. It did not happen, but here's just a little taste of it for you.
My name is Matthew Metro. I'm a survivor of sexual assault.
Okay, looks pretty fake, doesn't it? Yes. That was viewed over 5 million times in just 24 hours last week. Again, it is not true, the contents of it. The real Matthew Metro says, yeah, he went to the school that Walz taught at, but he never met him. And according to an investigation by the Washington Post, Matthew Metro, the deep fake, is most likely the work of a former Florida police officer who fled to Moscow. His name is John Mark Dugan. The paper reports that Dugan has become one of the Kremlin's most prolific propagandists, working directly with Russian military intelligence. So that's where it's probably come from. And this is just the kind of misinformation and election interference that US intelligence agencies have been warning about this year, not just from Russia, but also potentially from Iran, China, North Korea and others. Now, as fake as that seems, chances are, if 5 million people see it, some of them are going to believe it. Think of the Nigerian scam emails. They seem ridiculous, and yet somebody will fall for them. Meanwhile, another woman has come forward this week to accuse Donald Trump of sexual assault. Former professional model Stacey Williams. She says that she was groped by Trump in 1993 as a part of what she described as a, quote, twisted game between Trump and the late sexual abuser Jeffrey Epstein. Trump, who of course has already been found liable for the sexual abuse of writer E. Jean Carroll, which the judge said amounted to rape, and famously boasted about sexually assaulting women on the infamous Access Hollywood tape. Well, he's denied this latest claim. But I juxtapose these two stories for a reason, Chaz.
Why?
Because when fake allegations against Tim Walz go around, small number of people are going to believe it. A lot of other people are just going to be, have you heard something dodgy about that? Apparently it's not true. So it has the effect of casting doubt on Tim Walz, casting doubt on the people who have been the victims of sexual abuse when they make allegations. It creates this narrative that there's fake allegations floating around out there. So when a story such as this from 1993 surfaces, a woman saying, I too was attacked by Donald Trump, I suspect it means that a greater number of people are going to go, that's more fakery. Yeah, it's not a deep fake, but it's a quote in a paper. He's denied it. Tim Walz has denied it. Everyone's denied it. There's so much. Who knows what to believe? And they tend to cancel each other out.
That's so right. The point of misinformation, I've seen many experts point out, is not to convince people of something else. It's to make people cynical and nihilist and not to believe anything.
Who knows what to believe? You just muddy the waters.
They don't care about truth anymore. They only care about success. That's the way you get a strong man. And so that is the whole point of misinformation. I just want to just make one very quick point about this. Just how widespread this was. You mentioned that the original got millions of views. There was actually a second iteration of it. There's a guy called DocNet YouTube on Twitter, confusingly, otherwise known as Black Insurrectionist, who's responsible for a lot of these kinds of misinformation tactics. That same person put out supposedly an interview with this Matthew Metro character, with lots of emails. And once again, it was obviously not true. There was a cursor mark at one point in time, like he'd obviously screen capped when he'd just been typing the supposed email from Matthew Metro. The date stamps sometimes had commas and sometimes they didn't. It was the paragraph wasn't aligned properly in the email. It was pretty shoddy, but lots of people believed it. And like that video you cited before, 5.4 million people in 22 hours saw these allegations. Then when they were called out, it disappeared. Turned out that person was apparently Storm 1516, which are a Russian disinformation group responsible for many of these hoaxes. In particular, one of the hoaxes was that Ukrainians were spending their aid money on yachts. And J.D. Vance swallowed it.
There are people who would cut Social Security, throw our grandparents into poverty. Why? So that one of Zelensky's ministers can buy a bigger yacht? Kiss my ass, Steve. It's not happening.
So, John, everyone's looking at this. J.D. Vance is believing it. What do we do about this?
Well, personally, I wouldn't nominate someone like J.D. Vance to be Vice President of the United States if that's his level of fact-checking. But look, we've got an expert standing by. We'll ask him about it because our special guest on Planet America's Fireside Chat this week is Admiral Mike Rogers. He served as the Director of America's National Security Agency and US Cyber Command under both President Barack Obama and Donald Trump. Since retiring from service, he remains active in the national security and cybersecurity space. Admiral Rogers joined us here for a Fireside Chat a little earlier today. Admiral Mike Rogers, welcome to the Fireside Chat.
Thank you for the opportunity.
So far on the show, Admiral, we've been talking in part about the deep fakes that are becoming a part of this election campaign, these false allegations against Vice Presidential nominee Tim Walz. I mean, those things, clearly fakes, look kind of ridiculous. Do those things, do you think, have a significant impact on the race, or are the cyber threats, the kind of misinformation or disinformation that's flying around, come in different forms?
I mean, I think the reality is you just don't know. I mean, we don't have an empirical, and I've been testifying before Congress, I've been asked the same question, and my answer was, look, the reality is, number one, we just don't know. I also think it's reflective of a society that in many ways is just becoming numb to this kind of activity. There's just so many uses of technology to make these really wild and distorted allegations or perceptions that, you know, I'm not sure how much it really affects individuals. It's unfortunate that it's happening, don't get me wrong. No one should have to go through this kind of thing.
As this progresses, this foreign misinformation, let's say it gets bigger and gets more sophisticated as it goes on. How does it compare, though, to the domestic misinformation? Is it just swamped by the domestic information, or is foreign misinformation a genuine concern compared to the domestic misinformation?
So first, I think you make a very important point. There's a domestic component to this as well as an international component of this. The international component tends to get a lot of attention, if you will. The domestic component is growing. You know, that's a sad comment in some ways, but it's a view that from many people's opinion, and hey, this can be used to manipulate opinion, to potentially change outcomes, to maybe drive perceptions. Unfortunately, it's increasing in both segments. You're seeing both domestic increases of this, but you're also seeing international actors, the Russians, the Chinese, the Iranians. They believe that it clearly is having some measure of effect. Don't know if that's true or not, but they seem to be upping the game. This doesn't seem to be decreasing.
US intelligence agencies, Admiral, have assessed that Russia is once again actively involved in trying to promote President Trump, to try and do what they can to get him re-elected. You were there in 2016.
In 2016, yes.
When this happened for the first time. What are your enduring memories of that time? How concerned were you? And also the concern that a lot of people had when it seemed as though Donald Trump and his campaign were more than playing footsie with Russia. They were saying, help us out if you want to. WikiLeaks, I love WikiLeaks. You're on the inside then. When you're hearing that stuff, what are you thinking?
So first, I thought one of the challenges was we had not seen this level of interference from the Russians before. It wasn't that we hadn't seen the Russians attempt to influence perception or to change people's perceptions or to attempt to divide our nation. That is not something that is new. What was different in 2016 was the scale and the use of social media. We just had never seen it on such a huge scale, and that social media had become such a significant component of the Russian strategy. That was somewhat new. So I can remember both talking to President Obama as we're briefing him on, hey, here's what we've seen, sir. Then the discussion about, okay, so what should we communicate to the Russians and how should we do it? Should we do it publicly? Should we do it quietly, if you will, directly? The decision at the time, I remember this in September of 16, was ultimately made. It happened to be that President Obama was going to be interacting with Putin, and so the decision was made, hey, they're going to have a conversation about it. And the basis of the conversation was, Vladimir, we know exactly what you're doing. We have awareness of this. You really need to stop this, both because it's not going to be effective because we have an awareness of it, but secondly, if you continue to do this, we are prepared to take action. The reality was then that conversation from memory occurs towards the end of September of 16. As we approach the election in November, the Russians aren't backing off. We continue to see the same level of effort. And I remember thinking back on that, we should have been, I'll only speak for myself, I wish we had been more public, more aggressive about not just naming and shaming, but talking about what we were going to do. It was only after the election that we then implemented a series of sanctions. For example, we shut down a couple Russian facilities and we deported, if you will, a handful of Russian diplomats to say, look, in response to your activity, we're going to reduce your footprint in the United States.
Admiral, in recent weeks, we've heard from the former head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mark Milley, and in recent days from another former four-star general, former Chief of Staff to President Trump, John Kelly, both essentially saying in their assessment Donald Trump is, in the case of Milley, fascist to the core. In the case of Kelly, meets the general definition of fascist, certainly authoritarian, dictatorial tendencies. Both quite damning, given that these are two military men who, as well as swearing an oath to the Constitution, there's an unwritten oath that you do not get involved in politics, certainly not partisan politics. How significant are those comments and what do you make of them? Do you concur with them?
So, first of all, every American citizen, regardless of whether you're in the military or not in the military, everyone is entitled to their opinion and their political views. That's one of our rights. It's a strength of our nation, I believe. I am a proponent of when we're in uniform and when we're retired as senior military. I'm a good example. You didn't say to me when we first met each other, I'd like you to meet Mike Rogers. You said, I'd like you to meet Admiral Mike Rogers. You just never, when you're a senior, like a four-star, you don't ever walk away from that. So I always felt strongly when I was in the military, and now that I'm retired, that I can best serve the nation that I support and I believe in, my own country, by not inserting myself into the political process, by not voicing opinions I might have. I am not going to spend my time making statements or characterizations about any politician, even though in this case, John and Mark, friends, we've known each other, we served together. All three of us worked for President Trump when he was the President of the United States. I have worked with then Senator then Senator Harris, who was in the Oversight Committee in the Senate, responsible for oversight of the National Security Agency. So I've spent plenty of time with her, sometimes one-on-one, discussing different issues. But I just am not going to get into this characterization, in part because my view is, if you're not careful, this politicizes the military. And one of the reasons why the military has been effective in many ways, in my opinion, is the fact that our society views us as, you guys don't take sides. You serve the nation to the best of your ability, and you remain true to the oath that you took to defend the Constitution.
Having worked with Obama, under Obama, right, under Trump, and with Kamala Harris, they all will presumably have different styles. I'm not asking you to...
Three very dissimilar individuals.
Well, exactly. I'm not asking you to criticize any of them or to compliment any of them, but how would you describe the difference in working under them or with them?
So President Obama, by background, a constitutional lawyer, a community activist before he became a senator. We're both from Illinois. He was very much, he rapidly assimilated information, often in the written form. So when you brief the president, you always provide a written package to the president in advance, normally 24 to 48 hours. I never had an interaction with him where he had not read all the briefing material. And he would literally walk in and say, okay, Mike, I've read the material. Here's the 4 things I want us to focus on. He was always well prepared. I found him to be a very strong leader. He cared very much about team and the idea of loyalty to the mission, loyalty to each other. On the other hand, there was always a bit of a wall. You never got to Barack Obama, the individual. You just never got through that barrier. President Trump, on the other hand, when you first met him, he's almost gregarious, tall, large, walks up to you, gives you a big handshake. He would oftentimes slap me on the back, punch me in the shoulder. He's a bit of a Hale and Hardy kind of guy. He had no knowledge or experience in government, had never served in politics, never served in Washington. So his incoming bias was, I'm a business guy. What does that mean? I care about outcomes. I'm not focused on process. And I believe that we need to make decisions more quickly. So I had never met a guy who was willing to make such significant decisions so quickly. President Obama, for example, loved consensus. He often would tell us, I'll take the time it gets for us to come together with a kind of consensus recommendation to me. President Trump, very different, was very much, okay, I don't want the 20 years of background on this issue, so tell me what the issue is, tell me what the recommendation is, and what are you looking for me to do? He was always like this, always very quick. On the other hand, he had a different view of loyalty in some ways. His experience had been as a chief executive officer. He had never been the president of the United States or served in politics. So he very much felt, hey, look, in essence, I am the CEO of the nation. So I want you to have the same loyalty to me that I would expect as a business CEO. And, as a military guy, you're trying to, well, sir, the oath that I take is to the Constitution. It's not to an administration. It's not to an individual. So at times, I think President Trump found that a little frustrating. It was different from his experience. Senator Harris, the thing that I was always struck by her, she was a prosecutor. So when you dealt with her, she could rapidly assimilate a lot of information. She was always well prepared on the issue, and she always wanted to ask you questions. She preferred yes or no answers, and she wanted to drive you to a conclusion that she already had. She very much was like a prosecutor who in a court case is, look, I am trying to evoke a set of answers that will create a verdict in the mind of the judge or the jury. I'm not interested necessarily in all the background. She was very much, hey, let's stay focused, let's get to the answer, which can be challenging if you're sitting there in a Senate hearing and you're trying to say, well, it's not yes or no and it's not black or white. This is a complicated issue with many dimensions. And you're being told, Admiral, I'm looking for a yes or no here. That can be a challenge sometimes, but a very intelligent individual. And she was clearly very committed to her job. I mean, she really prepared. I never saw her not prepared in our interactions.
What is the actual greatest concerns facing the NSA today? Does misinformation rate at all in their pantheon of concerns?
I mean, it does. Look, what I used to tell when I would be asked by Congress and I'd be asked by the president, Mike, what do you think are our greatest concerns or greatest issues? The one that always concerned me the most was the fact that in an open democratic society, how do we deal with the fact that adversaries externally, actors internally, are using our very freedoms combined with advanced technology to actually turn this idea of free speech, broad spreading of opinions. They're actually trying to turn that against us. I thought that is our greatest challenge because the attempts to try to deal with it, they start to get you out of your comfort zone. Hey, what's the role of government? Should government do some sort of censorship, some sort of control? What's the role of the private sector that runs those platforms, that runs those social media outlets? What responsibility do they have? Those are interesting questions that traditionally we haven't had to deal with very much, but that's the reality of the world we're dealing with now. That probably was always the greatest concern because the byproduct of all that effort, it fuels this division. It fuels this inability of our nation to come to a consensus, to come together. What you always hope, and the American experience has always been, we may disagree with each other on an average daily basis, but when we come to a crisis, when we come to a significant issue, think 9/11, et cetera, we come together and we we lower our disagreements and we focus on what we can do collectively to achieve a better outcome. That's the strength of America. Now, I will say the flip side is that is seemingly getting harder and harder to do. And you hope it doesn't take the trauma of a 9/11 where 1,200 people are killed in a terrorist attack. You hope that that's not what it takes to remind ourselves, look, we can disagree, but as a nation, we need to come together to try to achieve some outcomes, both to help our security, our economic well-being, but as well as our friends and allies like Australia, as well as the broader world around us. Look, America has been blessed with a lot of advantages. I'd like to see us use those advantages, not only to help ourselves, but to try to help others.
Admiral Mike Rogers, thank you so much for taking a fireside chat with us.
Thank you very much. Appreciate the opportunity.
Now, being a country with more guns than people, America has long wrangled with the challenges of keeping track of all that weaponry. But there is a new issue that could open up an even bigger, massive loophole in America's gun laws. Yet another one. And it's gone all the way to the Supreme Court. Melina Wicks examines the case of ghost guns.
The Supreme Court just heard a case about ghost guns. What are ghost guns?
Ghost guns, or privately made firearms, are weapons that can be made at home with kits or 3D printers. That means they lack serial numbers, which makes them untraceable.
Yes, just like America's commitment to gun safety laws, they are untraceable. It's legal in America to make a gun at home without serial numbers or background checks. But that used to be a hard thing to do. Now there are companies selling kits that make it much easier.
It's built from a perfectly legal, pre-packaged kit and then made into a working firearm in the amount of time it takes to build an IKEA cabinet.
Here's hoping they do a better job than I did with my IKEA cabinets. The use of ghost guns in crimes went up 1,000% between 2017 and 2021. So under Biden, the Department of Justice issued a rule subjecting gun-making kits to the same requirements as store-bought guns. But pro-gun groups argue they're not selling guns, they're selling gun parts. The case basically comes down to this question. What is a gun? Is this a gun? How easy does it have to be to turn this into a gun for it to be a gun? And how many analogies do we have to get through before the Supreme Court finds one they like?
I put out on a counter some eggs, some chopped up ham, some chopped up pepper and onions. Is that a Western omelet?
Would your answer change if you ordered it from HelloFresh and you got a kit and it was like turkey chili, but all of the ingredients are in the kit?
I'm starting to think they held this hearing just before lunch. So what are these gun kits for? Lawyers arguing in favor of ghost guns say they're for hobbyists who like to build things themselves. But it's hard not to suspect it's actually about sticking it to the government when you see products that print images like this in lieu of serial numbers. Rude. You're in America. A child could be using that gun. People who buy ghost guns don't all want to break the law. But the reality is, when ghost guns were legal, their use in crimes went up. When they were forced to comply with the rules around serial numbers and background checks, the market collapsed. The Supreme Court won't give their final ruling on the case until next year. But we shouldn't kid ourselves about the impact a ban would have on gun violence overall. America is already a country that has more guns than people. And there are lots of ways for criminals to get guns in the US that are easier than building one from a kit. In some states, if you can't pass a background check, you can just buy a gun secondhand or steal one. And if you want a gun without a serial number, you can remove it or buy one of the millions of guns that were made before 1968 when serial numbers became mandatory. I'm not saying you should. I'm just saying you don't have to be a criminal genius to get around gun laws in the US. Now, someone please get the Supreme Court some lunch.
I just want to follow up on Justice Alito's question about the omelet.
With Election Day in the United States less than 2 weeks away now and tens of millions of votes already cast, the polls are close and seemingly getting even closer. Less than 2 points separating Harris and Trump nationally, according to the Cook Political Report's average of polls. And in the 538 average of swing state polls, Trump has gained ground this week, with Pennsylvania now tied. It is also a dead heat in Wisconsin. While Harris has a 1-point lead in Michigan, Trump is up by 1 in North Carolina and less than 2 points ahead in Georgia and Arizona, while Nevada is now a dead heat. So all 7 battleground states within 2 percentage points. It is still a statistical tie. The question is whether the polls are right or whether they've missed maybe 4 or 5% of Trump support as they did in both 2016 and 2020. And then, of course, in 2022, when Trump wasn't on the ballot, the polls tended to overestimate the Republican support. The red wave of 2022 didn't happen. So we don't know at this point, Chaz, whether those polling misses are because of a hidden Trump factor that pollsters are continuing to miss, or whether it is an adjustment that has now been made in their methodology and these are going to be exactly right, in which case you'd have to say Kamala Harris still has her nose in front. But we have never had, certainly not in the last century, a case where more than half a dozen battleground states are within the margin of error.
Yeah, honestly, I actually feel like polling's useless at the moment. Like we've got 7 states where the polls could be correct and all possible outcomes could occur.
Yes.
While the polls are still correct.
Yeah.
It could be a tie, it could be a clean sweep on either side, and the polls would still be correct.
And important to remember, polls are not votes. And with non-compulsory voting in the United States, the polls could, it's one thing to pick up the phone and talk to a pollster and say, yeah, I'm going to vote for Kamala Harris. But does the Harris campaign make sure you get that postal ballot or you get to the voting place, either to early vote or vote on the day? That is where, as Mike Madrid told us on Planet America this week, the ground game, the get out the vote, the hard work of volunteers and campaign officers, people holding umbrellas over people's heads as they wait in 5-hour queues outside a polling station, that can make a difference of about, well, the conventional wisdom, 0.5 percentage point.
Yes.
All of these states could be determined by less than 0.5 percentage point.
Absolutely. And so for that reason, I'm not even going to talk about the general polls at the moment. I just think we just need to wait 2 weeks and find out.
Yeah.
That's where I'm at.
And it may take even longer than that.
That is correct. What I am going to talk about, though, are broad trends in demographics, which I think could determine the election. Some trade-offs. The first trade-off isn't even a demographic trade-off. It's a trade-off between favourability of the candidates versus favourability of their administrations. Because basically, the polls say Kamala Harris has a 50% favourability, personally.
50%.
Yep. Trump has a 40% favourability, personally. Whereas their administration is the other way round.
So she's going to win.
No. The Trump administration now has a favourability of 50%, and Kamala Harris-Biden administration has a favourability of 40%.
So Trump's going to win.
I don't know. It's a trade-off. But then you got the demographic trade-offs. Number one, you've got a lot of people talked about this one. You got Trump stealing Latino and black men away from the Democrats, while Harris is stealing white women away from the Republicans. They're basically balanced out the number of voters in those two groups. Who steals more voters determines the election. So that's another trade-off.
White women are traditionally more likely to vote than brown and black men.
Yeah.
There could be an advantage there.
But in terms of the actual voters, they're usually about matched. So yeah, but maybe this time there'll be more of one than the other. We don't know. Another trade-off, and this one doesn't get talked about so much. We know that Trump's pinching young men from Democrats. We know that. In some of the polls, Trump is owning the young men by double digits. But what we don't talk about so much is that Kamala Harris is pinching old people from Republicans. Even in the last election, Joe Biden lost the over 65s by 3 points. Mr. Old lost the old people. But Kamala Harris in the latest New York Times Siena poll is ahead by 2 points amongst old people. If there's a 5-point swing in old people, they are the biggest voting group in an election. That would be massive. We'll just have to find out. That's a trade-off again.
Interesting to see maybe America's ageing baby boomers returning to their progressive roots. Maybe. As a final flush.
Maybe.
Maybe.
And another little factor which hasn't been talked about at all was earlier in the year, in May, the number one predictor of whether someone had defected from Joe Biden in 2020 to now was whether they were Middle Eastern or North African. Now, obviously, that was Gaza related. But the number two predictor of whether someone was going to defect from Joe Biden was whether they had a very favourable view of Joe Rogan. If you had a very favourable review of Joe Rogan, and you supported Biden in 2020, it was only 49% of them still supported Biden at the beginning in May this year. 40% of them had already defected. Donald Trump is on Joe Rogan today. This could be massive for his campaign. There are a lot of gettable Biden 2020 voters there for him.
Well, unless all the Democrats that were listening to Joe Rogan said, no, I'm sick of this guy, he's going weird.
Maybe. Just want to flag that. But one more thing, if Trump has made a run in the last week or two...
If it's not all just the pro-Republican polls juicing the numbers.
Yeah, if he actually has made a run, I want to point to maybe why.
Yep.
We've been talking a lot about immigration and crime and inflation. Fascism, democracy. That's not what Trump is spending money on. And money talks, John. What Trump is actually spending money on in the swing states, he spent $30 million in the last few weeks on, is almost exclusively this ad.
Kamala supports taxpayer-funded sex changes for prisoners.
Surgery.
For prisoners.
For prisoners. Every transgender inmate in the prison system would have access.
It's hard to believe, but it's true. Even the liberal media was shocked Kamala supports taxpayer-funded sex changes for prisoners and illegal aliens.
Every transgender inmate would have access.
Kamala's for they, them. President Trump is for you.
I'm Donald J. Trump, and I approve this message.
Now, Kamala Harris was predictably asked about that issue when she had an interview on Fox, and this is what she had to say.
Are you still in support of using taxpayer dollars to help prison inmates or detained illegal aliens to transition to another gender?
I will follow the law, and it's a law that Donald Trump actually followed. You're probably familiar with, now it's a public report, that under Donald Trump's administration, these surgeries were available on a medical necessity basis to people in the federal prison system. And I think, frankly, that ad from the Trump campaign is a little bit of like throwing, stones when you're living in a glass house. He spent $20 million on those ads, trying to create a sense of fear in the voters because he actually has no plan in this election that is about focusing on the needs of the American people.
Now, to be clear, Kamala Harris is correct that the law is that the gender reassignment surgeries have to be funded. The courts have held that. As of 2022, that is the law. She has no choice. What she's incorrect about was that under Trump, there were no gender reassignment surgeries because it wasn't the law at that point in time. Under Trump, they provide an array of gender-affirming treatments, including hormone therapy for a small group of inmates who requested it. So they helped out the inmates who were transgender, but not with gender reassignment surgeries. Okay, so they're the facts. But is this campaign a potential election-winning campaign in your view?
Yeah, because, when it comes to a culture war kind of issue, a lot of people that see that ad are not going to be thinking of somebody who is receiving appropriate health care as mandated by the law of the United States, just as if they were receiving cancer treatment. That should continue just because they're incarcerated for whatever reason. The same applies for somebody who's transitioning from one gender to another. It can be tremendously dangerous to interrupt these things and so on, and they have a right to get that health care. But of course, a lot of people watching these ads are thinking it's some 300-pound guy named Bubba who says, you know what, I'm going to become a chick. And the taxpayers are paying to turn Bubba into a chick so he can go and be a creep in a public toilet somewhere near where their kids are going to be. That's what politics makes of these very complex, nuanced, personal healthcare issues and turns them into political garbage.
For what it's worth, from a polling point of view, the issues involving transgender people don't tend to poll terribly well. Like when we're talking about, say, sports, about transgender women playing in women's sports, or bathrooms, transgender women using women's bathrooms, they don't tend to poll terribly well. But what does poll very well is saying transgender people shouldn't be discriminated against. It really depends how you spin it.
Yeah.
And so I don't know how that plays in an election campaign where, as you say, nuance goes to die. But I can tell you this, Trump's team clearly thinks this is an election winner because they're sinking all their money in swing states into only this issue. So on after Election Day. We'll look at the polls and the exit polls, and we'll see if it works.
Yeah, and it won't be just literally this issue. It'll be a broader narrative of Kamala Harris is woke. They've got crazy ideas. They're not like us. Their values are different to us. Yeah, all of that kind of thing. So it goes big picture as well. But that is all the time we have for another Fireside Chat. Hope to see you at 9:30 p.m. next Wednesday night for Planet America pre-election special, or from 9 o'clock on ABC iView, YouTube and Facebook.
I'm going to have another Fireside Chat next week as well. And do not forget the PEP podcast, where next week I'll tell you folks what we learnt from your correspondences about America taxing expats. It will be right there. See you then.
Bye-bye.